The 16th evening. I know a Punchinello, the moon said. The audience rejoices whenever he appears. Every moment he makes is so comical that it brings roars of laughter in the house. And yet there is nothing remarkable in his work to account for this. It is more his peculiarity. Even when he was only a boy playing about with the other boys, he was a Punchinello. Nature had shaped him for the character by putting a hump on his back and another on his chest. But the mind and soul hidden under the deformities were, on the contrary, richly endowed. No one possessed a deeper feeling, a stronger spiritual feeling than he. The theater was his ideal world. If he had been tall and handsome, he might have become a great tragedian on any stage. His soul was filled with all that was heroic and great. Still, it was his fate to be a Punchinello. His very sadness, his melancholy, heightened the dry wit of his sharply drawn face, and aroused the laughter of a vast audience, which lustily applauded its favorite. A lovely Columbine was gentle and kind to him, yet she preferred to marry Harlequin. It would indeed have been too funny if in reality Beauty and the Beast had married. Whenever Punchinello was dejected, she was the only one who could bring a smile to his lips. Yes, she could even make him laugh loudly. At first, she was as melancholy as he, then somewhat calmer, and at last overflowing with gaiety. "I know well enough what's the matter with you," she said. "You are in love." And then he couldn't help laughing. "Love and I," he cried. "That would be funny indeed. How the public would applaud." "It's love," she continued, and added with comical pathos, "It is I you love." "Yes, one may speak this way when one thinks there is no love in the other's heart." Punchinello laughed heartily and jumped high into the air, and his melancholy was forgotten. And yet she had spoken the truth. He did love her, loved her deeply, as he loved all that was great and noble in art. On her wedding day he seemed the merriest of the merry, but that night he wept. If people had seen his tormented face, they would have applauded him more than ever. A few days ago Columbine died. On the day of her burial, Harlequin had permission not to appear on the stage, for he was a grief-stricken widower. The manager had to present something very gay, so that the public would not miss the pretty Columbine and the graceful Harlequin. Therefore the nimble Punchinello had to be doubly merry, with grief in his heart. He danced and skipped about, and all applauded and cried, "Bravo, bravissimo!" Punchinello was called back again and again. Oh, he was priceless. After the performance last night, the poor little man strolled out of the town to the lovely churchyard. The wreath of flowers on Columbine's grave had already faded. There he sat, and what a study for a painter. With his chin on his hand and his eyes turned toward me, he looked like a grotesque monument. Punchinello on the grave, strange and comical. If the public had seen their favorite, how they would have applauded and cried, "Bravo, Punchinello, bravo, bravissimo." The 17th evening. Listen to what the moon told me. I have seen a cadet become an officer and dress himself in his handsome uniform for the first time. I have seen a young maiden in her ball gown and the happiness of a prince, pretty young bride in her wedding dress, but no joy can be compared to that which I saw last evening in a child, a little girl 4 years old. She had received a new blue dress and a new rose-colored bonnet. She was already dressed in her finery, and everyone called for candles, as my beams were too faint through the window, and more light was needed. The little girl stood as stiff as a doll, her arms carefully stretched away from the frock, the fingers spread wide apart from one another. Oh, how her eyes and every feature beamed with joy. "Tomorrow you shall go for a walk," said her mother. The little girl looked up at her bonnet and down at her dress and smiled happily. "Mother," she said, "what will the dogs think when they see me in these beautiful things?" 18th evening. I have told you about Pompeii, the moon said. That corpse of a city that is now once more listed among living cities. I know another, an even stranger one. It is not a corpse, but rather the phantom of a city. Whenever water splashes from the fountains into marble basins, I seem to hear the tale of a floating city. Yes, the spouting water can tell about it. The waves of the sea sing about it. Over the face of the ocean there often hangs a mist, her widow's veil, for the bridge-groom of the ocean is dead. His city and his palace are now but a mausoleum. Do you know this city? Never was the rattle of carriages or the clatter of horses' hooves heard in its streets. Only fish swim there, while the black gondola glides ghost-like over the green waters. I will show you the largest square in the city, the piazza, continued the moon, and you will imagine yourself in fairyland. The grass grows up between the broad flagstones, and in the early dawn thousands of tame pigeons flutter about the tall, isolated tower. There are archways about you on 3 sides, and beneath one of them sit the motionless Turk with his long pipe and the handsome young Greek leaning against the pillar, gazing up at the trophies aloft, at the tall masts monuments of a lost power. The flags hang down like a morning crib. A girl is resting there. She has set down her heavy pails of water, though the yoke by which she carries them is still across her shoulders. She is leaning against the mast of victory. The building you see before you is not a fairy castle, but a church. The gilded domes and the golden balls around it glitter in my rays. Those magnificent bronze horses up there have traveled like the bronze horse in the fairy tale. They have journeyed to distant lands and returned. Can you see the brilliant colors on the walls and window panes? It is as if, at a child's plea, a fairy had decorated this strange temple. Can you see the winged lion upon that column? He still glitters with gold, but his wings are bound. The lion is dead, for the king of the ocean is dead. The great halls are empty, and where gorgeous pictures once hung there are now bare walls. Beggars sleep beneath the archways, whereas once only great nobles were permitted to tread the pavement there. A sigh sounds from the deep dungeons, or as from the leaden chambers near the Bridge of Sighs, where once were heard the tambourines and the gay gondolas, just as they were when the wedding ring was cast from the glorious Bucentaur into the Adriatic, the queen of the ocean. Wrap yourself in your mists, O Adriatic. Cover yourself with the widow's veil, and let it unwrap your bridge-groom's mausoleum. Marble, ghost like Venice. 19th evening. I looked down into a larger theater, said the moon. The audience filled the house, for a new actor was making his first appearance. My rays glided through a small window in the wall, and I saw a painted face with the forehead pressed against the pane. It was the hero of the evening. The knightly beard curled from his chin, but there were tears in his eyes, for he had been hissed from the stage, and for a good reason. Poor fellow, but incompetence cannot be tolerated in the world of art. He had a deep feeling and loved his art with a fervor, but art did not love him. The prompter's bell tinkled. In his part was written, "Boldly and valiantly the hero advances," and he had to appear before an audience which ridiculed him. When the play was ended, he saw a man, muffled in a cloak, sneak down the stairs. It was he, the crushed hero of the evening. The stage hands whispered to each other. I followed the poor fellow to his room. Hanging oneself is an unsightly death, and poison is not always at hand. I know he was thinking of both. I saw him look at his pale face in the mirror and peep through half-closed eyes to decide whether he would look well as a corpse. A man may be very unhappy, at the same time very affected. He thought of death, of suicide, and I believed he pitied himself. He wept bitterly. And when a man has wept until no more tears can come, he no longer thinks of suicide. A year had passed since then, and again a play was produced, but in a little theater. By a company of poor wandering players, I again saw that familiar face with the curled beard, the painted cheeks. Again he looked up at me and smiled, and yet he had again been hissed from the stage, only a minute before. Hissed from a miserable stage, hissed by a miserable audience. That same evening, a shabby hearse drove out of the gate of the town with no one following. It was a suicide, our painted and hissed hero. The only attendant was the driver of the hearse, and none but the moon followed it. The suicide lies buried in a corner by the churchyard wall. Nettles will soon grow over his grave, and the gravedigger will fling over it the weeds and thorns he roots from the other graves. 20th evening. I come from Rome, the moon said. There on one of the 7 hills in the middle of the city are the ruins of the emperor's palace. The wild fig tree grows in the breaches of the wall and covers its bareness with broad gray-green leaves. The donkey treads on the green laurels and enjoys the barren thistle among the heaps of rubbish. To this spot, from which the Roman eagles once flew out over the world and came, saw, and conquered, an entrance now leads through a humble little house built of clay and wedged between 2 broken marble columns. Vine tendrils hang down like a mourning wreath over the crooked window. An old woman lives there with her little granddaughter. They are now the rulers of the emperor's palace and show the place to tourists. A bare wall is all that remains of the magnificent throne hall, and the long shadow of a dark cypress points to the spot where the throne once stood. There is earth, a yard high on the broken floor. The little girl, now the daughter of the emperor's palace, often sits there on her stool while the evening bells ring. Through the keyhole of a nearby door, which she calls her balcony window, she can overlook half of Rome, as far as the mighty dome of St. Peter's. The evening, as always, was still, and down below the little girl was walking in my full clear light, carrying an antique earthen pitcher of water on her head. She was barefooted, and her short skirt and little sleeves were torn. I kissed the child's finely rounded shoulders, her black eyes, and her dark, shining hair. She mounted the steps up to the house, which were steep and formed of broken bits of masonry and a crumbled column. Spotted lizards ran frightened past her feet, but she was not afraid of them. Her hand was raised to ring the doorbell. A rabbit's foot suspended from a string was now the bell handle of the emperor's palace. But she paused for a moment. What was she thinking of? Perhaps of the beautiful image of the infant Jesus, clad in silver and gold in the chapel below, where the silver lamps burned and where her little friends sang the hymn she knew so well. I do not know. She moved and stumbled. The earthen pitcher fell from her head and crashed on the marble step. She burst into tears. The beautiful daughter of the emperor's palace wept over a cheap broken clay pitcher. She stood there barefooted and wept, and dared not pull the string, the bell rope at the emperor's palace. The 21st evening. The moon hadn't shone for more than 2 weeks, and then at last I saw him again, round and clear above the slowly rising mass of clouds. Listen to what the moon told me. I followed a caravan out of one of the towns of Fezzan. The group halted near the sandy desert on a salt plain which glittered like an ice field and was covered to but a small extent with light drift sand. The oldest man in the caravan, at whose girdle hung the water flask, and on whose head was a sack of unleavened bread, drew a square figure on the ground with his staff and wrote inside it a few words from the Koran. And the whole caravan passed over the consecrated spot. A young merchant, a son of the East, as I could see from his sparkling eyes and his handsome figure, rode thoughtfully on his white snorting horse. Was he perhaps thinking of his pretty young wife at home? Only 2 days before, a camel covered with costly furs and splendid shawls had carried her, the lovely bride, along the walls of the city. Drums and bagpipes had sounded, and the woman had sung, while all around the camel there had been rejoicing and gunshots, the greatest number of which the bridge groom had fired. And now he was journeying with the caravan far away into the desert. I followed them on their way for many nights and saw them rest beside the wells under the palm trees. They plunged a knife into the breast of a camel that had fallen and roasted the meat at the fire. My rays cooled the glowing sands and showed them the black rocks, dead islands in the immense ocean of sand. They met no hostile tribes on their pathless route. No storms arose. No wave of sand whirled destruction over the caravan. At home, the lovely young wife prayed for her husband and her father. Are they dead? She asked my golden horn. Are they dead? She asked my brilliant orb. Now the desert lies behind them. This evening they are camped beneath tall palm trees, with the crane flying about them on long wings and the pelican watching them from the branches of mimosa. The luxuriant underbrush is trodden by the heavy feet of elephants. A troop of people is returning from a market in the interior. The women with indigo blue skirts and their black hair decked with brass buttons are driving heavily laden oxen on which the naked black children are lying asleep. A dude is leading by a rope a lion cub that he has bought. They approach the caravan. The young merchant sits silent and motionless, thinking of his beautiful wife in the land of the blacks. He is dreaming of his white and fragrant flower. Far away across the desert, he raises his head. A cloud and then another cloud passed across the face of the moon. I heard nothing more from him that evening. 22nd evening. I saw a little girl weeping, the moon said, weeping over the wickedness of the world. She had received the loveliest doll as a gift. Oh, what a doll that was. So pretty and delicate, and surely it could not have been made to experience hardship. But the little girl's brothers, who were tall boys, had placed the doll in a high tree in the garden and had them run away. The little girl couldn't reach the doll, and no way of helping it down, and that was why she was crying. The doll undoubtedly wept too, for it stretched out its arms to the green branches and looked very sad indeed. Yes, this was one of the hardships of the world, of which Mamma spoke so often. Oh, that poor doll! That evening twilight was already coming on, and night would soon be here. Did it have to sit alone in the tree out here all night long? No. The little girl didn't have the heart to let it do that. I'll stay with you, she said, although she really was not very brave. She already imagined she could see the little goblins in their tall pointed caps peeping out from the bushes, and tall ghosts dancing in the dark walk, coming closer and closer, stretching out their hands toward the tree where the doll sat, and laughingly pointing their fingers at it. Oh, how frightened the little girl was! But if we haven't done anything sinful, she thought, the evil spirits can't hurt us. I wonder if I have done something wrong, she thought for a moment. Oh yes, she said. I laughed at the poor little duck that had a red rag around its leg. It's so funny when it limps, and that's why I laughed at it. But I know it's wrong to laugh at animals. Then she looked up at her doll. Have you ever laughed at animals? She asked, and it seemed as if the doll shook its head. 23rd evening. I looked down on Tyrol, said the moon, and my rays caused the dark pine trees to cast heavy shadows across the rocks. I look at the figures of St. Christopher with the infant Jesus on his shoulder that are painted on the walls of the houses. Enormous figures that extend from the ground to the gables. Pictures of St. Florian pouring water on the burning house, and of Christ on the great roadside crosses. To the present generation, they are very old pictures, where I saw them being put up one after the other. High up on the slope of the mountain is a lonely nunnery, wedged in between the rocks in a swallow's nest. Two of the sisters were in the tower above, tolling the bell. They were both young, and therefore they looked out over the mountains into the wide world beyond. A traveling coach rolled by on the highway below, and the postilion's horn sounded. The poor nuns looked after the carriage for a moment with a mournful glance, and a tear gleamed in the eye of the younger one. The horn sounded more and more faintly, until at last the convent bell silenced its dying sound.